Mr. Giragosian, thank you very much for coming to Voice of America today and having the willingness to speak with us. You're here in Washington with the Carnegie Endowment Conference on the 20 years of South Caucasus. Just a couple of observations about the conference itself and what outcomes did you see already, if there are any?
Well, actually, we had a very interesting two-day conference where a number of experts and analysts and leading figures of civil society from Armenia, Azerbaijan, and Georgia came together. What was interesting was the conference was designed to present a new focus on a look back at 20 years. Where is the South Caucasus as a region? And it's not just post-war after 2008, and it's not just Nagorno-Karabakh, but in a general sense. What was most significant was the findings. Most of the participants, if not all, from Azerbaijan, Armenia, and Georgia were in virtual agreement into the fact that not enough democratic change or economic reform has been taking place. Much of the 20-year period has been lost, missed opportunities for actually going further and farther in terms of democratization and economic reform. And most importantly, as one of the Armenian participants eloquently stated, there should no longer be excuses. There shouldn't be excuses from the West or by the governments in Yerevan, Baku, and Tbilisi for this shortcomings in terms of moving forward. And what's interesting as well is many of the countries, despite the conflicts, have many of the same structural challenges. Social, economic disparities of wealth and income, and too often the citizens of the region as a whole have little choice and no real voice in politics.
You have previous Washington experience, and you probably followed what the U.S. foreign policy has been towards Caucasus to a degree. And would you say that throughout the times that you were not here, and from this conference, where probably the target audience was the policy groups in Washington, not politicians, but State Department employees and others who are directly involved with the region, has the policy as the region changed, and is there a U.S. policy on the region?
Well, that's a very good question, because to be quite honest with you, the reason the conference was so successful was because it was a wake-up call, if you will. It was a message to U.S. policymakers, revealing that the U.S., for the last two administrations, haven't really exerted or formulated a policy regarding the South Caucasus. In many ways, U.S. policy and engagement in the region is a subset of U.S.-Russian relations, or a byproduct of U.S.-Turkey, or U.S.-Iran, or an energy-related policy. There is no direct, concrete, specific U.S. policy. And the message from the conference participants was that's fine. If the U.S. doesn't want to be directly engaged, the Europeans do. And in many ways, it's also fine because the real challenge and the real test is on the leaders themselves in the region. And the real test of leadership is on the presidents in Armenia, Azerbaijan, and Georgia, and much less the excuse of U.S. policy or even Russian policy. But the second factor that's clear is, to the detriment of democratization and economic development, the U.S. needs to be not necessarily more engaged, but more critical in holding to account and challenging shortcomings. Most importantly, for example, in diplomacy, there should be a price to pay for intransigence, a price to pay for not being serious or sincere in terms of becoming a leader rather than just an official. In other words, the difference between strongmen and statesmen, the difference between governing and ruling a country is most evident in this region.
Well, obviously, within in the context of the Armenian-Azerbaijani relations, the direct talks between the two presidents seem to be impossible so far, even with, without others, say, Kazan meeting with Medvedev or the Troika, or the co-chairman countries, or the Minsk group. But right now, today, while we're speaking, Armenia's president is in Georgia, and apparently there has been some high-level going back and forth between Georgia and Armenia. But during the conference, some of the Georgians were speaking about some anti-Armenian rhetoric in Georgia, like Saakashvili is blamed to be an Armenian and pushing an ethnic policy to basically benefit the Armenians and stuff. So what are the main reasons, if there are any real negative if there is any real negative rhetoric in Georgia, what do you think are the reasons for this? Is this Javachetia? Is this what are the main obstacles, say, between Georgia and Armenia? Because for Armenia and Azerbaijan, it's a much longer topic, and we'll get to that.
Well, what's ironic is if we look at Armenian-Georgian bilateral relations only, and we leave aside Russia, we leave aside Azerbaijan, what's interesting is the good news is the same as the bad news. In other words, President Sargsyan and President Saakashvili now have a very close personal relationship, and that's good for getting over a potential conflict. It's also bad at the same time because President Saakashvili tends to be rather impulsive, rather unpredictable, and at times erratic in his leadership. And in many ways, for the fundamental divisions, whether it's Javak, Samske Javaketi, whether it's Georgia's relationship or balance between Turkey and Azerbaijan, not necessarily in favor of Armenia, or whether it's the Georgian monopoly on Armenian trade to overcome the blockade of Armenia, we see fundamental problems that are far from resolved, in fact, are simmering. More importantly, to be honest, if we look at recent history, Armenia and Georgia went to war in the early part of the century. There is not necessarily an overly friendly background. There is tension in this unpredictable relationship. But the two leaders are meeting face to face, and the governments are committed to diffusing tension. I only wish we had the same dynamic between Armenia and Azerbaijan, where unfortunately the Azerbaijani side refuses to meet the Armenian side alone or directly, just as they refuse to meet with the Nagorno-Karabakh officials.
Getting to Armenia, Azerbaijan, of course, probably a more complicated issue for now, at least. The layers may be more in the Armenia-Georgia relations and history, but with Armenia and Azerbaijan, we're basically in an ongoing war. Where do we stand today? And this may be a generally wide question, but I think that's where we have to address it. As from Kazan, we see that at least the Minsk co-chairman presidential process is in a limbo, if not in a deadlock, and where can we go from here on? And in your yesterday's presentation, as far as I know, you have probably assessed a bigger chance, a possibility for a possible armed conflict.
Well, yes, there's a danger of war, but in fact, a danger of war by accident, if you will. But this is a good question because let's step back and look at two broader dynamics at play. The first dynamic is Armenia-Turkey. In other words, the Armenian-Turkish dynamic of diplomatic engagement is not only about Armenia-Turkey, but it's about Nagorno-Karabakh and Armenia-Azerbaijan. But for this reason, Turkey is trying to correct a failed policy. And in fact, the first casualty or victim of Armenian-Turkish diplomacy was an end to the Azerbaijani-Turkish axis. One nation, two states doesn't exist anymore, if it ever did. What's interesting, though, and why Armenia-Turkey affects Nagorno-Karabakh, is because it no longer affects Karabakh. In other words, my point is, Nagorno-Karabakh is no longer accepted as a prerequisite or a precondition in Armenian-Turkish diplomacy. It was removed from the protocols without any concrete demand. That's the way it is seen in Moscow and Washington and Brussels. For Turkey now to try to reconnect the issues is disingenuous. But for Azerbaijan, it also challenges Azerbaijan to no longer hide behind its relationship with Turkey. And Azerbaijan is actually more isolated because of Armenian-Turkish diplomacy. But the second reason is even another dynamic, and that is the real test for Nagorno-Karabakh, in my opinion, will not be the Minsk group, will not even be the diplomacy. It will be to what degree is Armenia and Azerbaijan a democratic, stable society and stronger country. Until we have truly democratic players, we won't probably be able to resolve the Karabakh conflict. But in my opinion, as an analyst, Nagorno-Karabakh is not going back to Azerbaijan. What this is really about is trying to find a graceful way for Azerbaijan to let go of Nagorno-Karabakh but to regain the other territories outside of Nagorno-Karabakh. And until Azerbaijan realizes that it lost the war and will not regain Nagorno-Karabakh, then this diplomacy probably won't result in anything. And that's why greater democracy is more important. And also to legitimize any peace deal that is signed. For Armenia, what I think this means is the real imperative for the Armenians and for Armenian government is not Turkey nor Azerbaijan. It's internal. It's actually pursuing Armenian strength and stability through greater democratization, solving internal threats and challenges such as the so-called oligarchs, and making Armenia strong from within. Only then can Armenian foreign policy be stronger externally.
So what you're saying is internal legitimacy of the existing administration will definitely give a lot more on the foreign affairs.
Not necessarily. Internal legitimacy as a result of free and fair elections, as a result of more democratic credentials. Not necessarily only legitimacy.
We touched briefly not briefly, but the impact of the Armenia-Turkey dynamic in Nagorno-Karabakh. Just if we have to speak about today's Armenia-Turkey after the protocols are basically clearly suspended, they're not going anywhere, although both sides are showing a future interest in negotiating, at least based on that same piece of paper. Where do we stand today? Are we even in a worse situation than we were before the protocols were signed?
Well, it depends on who we is.
Armenia and Turkey. I'd like to call it Armenia-Turkey relations. So within the two states, on track one level, on governmental level, basically the process is stopped. At least the Armenian side is not showing any interest in continuing unless the protocols are adopted or accepted at the Turkish Mejlis. And the Turkish side is obviously showing no signs of interest to do that anytime soon. So if we have to speak about this, because there is the track 2 is another interesting process that is going much faster now, but on the intergovernmental level, let's say, where do we stand today, and overall the understanding of each other?
Good.
Do Armenians and Turks like or dislike each other more or less?
Well, it's a good question, but in many ways what's interesting is I recently met with Armenian Foreign Minister Nalbandian, and in many ways I was impressed. Because in terms of Armenian-Turkish diplomatic engagement, Armenia, in terms of foreign policy regarding Turkey, is in a stronger position, not weaker. Especially because all expectations and the burden is on Turkey, not Armenia. In fact, Armenia did everything it can and should and more in terms of committing itself to this process. It's Turkey that everyone is waiting for. And Turkey has been unsuccessful in trying to shift the blame or the burden back on Armenia. Armenia is quite ready to meet anywhere, anytime, any place. What's interesting, though, is Armenia is also in a stronger position in terms of Nagorno-Karabakh, mainly because of Kazan, because of the maximalist Azerbaijani diplomatic strategy, which is not a diplomatic strategy. It's asking for everything and more all at once. So Armenia is in a stronger position in terms of foreign policy, but that needs to be maintained and sustained. In other words, it may be temporary. Armenia needs to do more in terms of activity, but there is potential. Secondly, what's important, let's look at Nagorno-Karabakh. In my opinion, best case scenario, if Armenia and Turkey conclude successful diplomatic relations, open the borders, etc., best case scenario, it will make any compromise over Nagorno-Karabakh that much further away and that much more difficult politically. But the same result, worst case scenario. If the protocols are never enacted, never implemented, if Armenian-Turkish diplomacy doesn't resume, the same effect we'll see on Nagorno-Karabakh, making any compromise on Nagorno-Karabakh that much further away, that much harder politically. The result will be the same. Yet, Turkey realizes this policy of denying diplomatic relations, closed borders, that didn't work. It's searching for more options. Turkey is very upset and frustrated that Azerbaijan has the veto and such a strong power to block Turkish options. And In a recent meeting several months ago with Turkish Foreign Minister Davutoglu, several of us from Armenia listened to the foreign minister himself of Turkey explain that what Turkey's committed to is normalizing the abnormal. And in other words, the Turkish foreign minister himself admitted to this Armenian group that Turkish policy of closed borders and denying diplomatic relations is not normal. And it's something Turkey is finally realizing. Now, Turkey's moving much too slowly in terms of genocide recognition, etc. But the trend and the opportunity is there, because finally it's important to remember Armenian-Turkish diplomacy over this protocol process was never supposed to be easy, and it was never supposed to be that quick. We are talking about normalization. It's a longer task, and it's not reconciliation. That's when the genocide issue comes in. That's where genocide recognition is important. Reconciliation will probably take a generation at least. But the interesting thing, Armenia is in a stronger position externally regarding Turkey and Nagorno-Karabakh. It's the internal that's missing. We need a stronger democracy, a more equally developing Armenian society and economic situation, and we need to address Armenia's internal threats to security.
As you've been living in Armenia, and this would be the last question, for a while now, parliamentary elections are coming up in about 5 months, say on May, supposedly, and the officials, starting from the presidential level to the prime ministerial level, are talking all around that these are going to be the greatest elections ever, or these are going to really step forward towards a more democratic elections. What is your feeling about this? Do you trust that statement? Do you believe that even if there is a political will of a degree in today's Armenian internal political situation, is it possible to do a true, transparent and free elections?
Well, it's not a question of trust. It's more a question of being pleased. The more the Prime Minister and the Armenian President raise expectations themselves, promising the best ever elections, promising significant progress in free and fair elections, of course for the ordinary Armenian citizen, it's positive, but it's also met with a healthy dose of skepticism. Armenia's last free and fair election was its first, many years ago. And if anything, Armenia doesn't have the political culture that is used to a peaceful, ordinary secession or transfer of power process. The loser of the election in the Armenian context does not ordinarily congratulate the winner. Rather, the loser of every election usually challenges the results themselves. This is for a reason. So what needs to be done is not promises and pledges. That's important in terms of raising expectations. But we need a delivery. We need results. And we need not the promises and pledges from the Prime Minister or the President, but we need these promises and pledges to come true. This has not yet happened. And we are hoping that this election in particular is different for two reasons. It's the first election in Armenia since March 1st, 2008. The first true test of the Sargsyan administration, whether democracy is real or imitation. The second reason this election is more important is because scrutiny in external expectations and internal demands for change are much higher and much greater than ever before. This combination is an important test for the Armenian government. Hopefully the Armenian government will live up to this challenge, to its own credibility. But what's important is this is a different time, a different context. This is not a conflict or a political confrontation between the opposition and the government. No longer. This is a conflict within the ruling elite of Armenia, within the pro-government coalition. It's a battle between the Republican Party of Serge Sargsyan and prosperous Armenia of Mr. Tsarukyan and former President Kocharyan. This is the battle, and this is the test for the future of Armenia.
In fact, just today, another prosperous Armenia a regional head was arrested for narcotics, a third one. But you mentioned, just to clarify, you mentioned Tsarukyan and Kocharyan together. Do you still see Kocharyan behind prosperous Armenia? And do you see this a fight between the two presidents, the previous one and the...
Well, let's be honest. Prosperous Armenia is widely seen as a political vehicle, if not creation, of Robert Kocharyan, former President Kocharyan's supporters. What we see is Prosperous Armenia is perceived and interpreted very much as representing the interests and perhaps political aspirations of former President Kocharyan, unlike the Republican Party, which is very much the president, Serge Sargsyan. What this means, however, is it's not a battle between Sargsyan and Kocharyan directly. It's a battle by proxy. In other words, Republican Party versus Prosperous Armenia. But if we look at President Kocharyan's statements, pledging his political ambition, etc., there's been a lot of distortion and overreaction. In many ways, President Kocharyan every day is more a former president and should be respected as such, holding the office. And President Sargsyan every day is more the current president. And there is a dynamic at play. For President Kocharyan to return to active politics now seems unlikely and perhaps dangerous, given the March 2008 dynamic. But what Kocharyan is saying in many of his interviews, if we read it carefully, is he's not promising to return as president or even prime minister, but to exert political influence and perhaps protect his political party in this parliamentary context. What this means in terms of a confrontation is that the Republican Party has been confronting Prosperous Armenia. But Prosperous Armenia and the supporters of former President Kocharyan have not yet fought back. So this is far from over.
Okay, so let's hope there will be a truly a big change in the upcoming elections.
There better be.
Yeah.
More than hope, there must be.
Yeah, very good. Thank you very much, Mr. Giragosian. Thank you for your time.
Thank you.
We hope to see you again here back in Washington, D.C. sometime soon.
Thank you.